I will say good morning. It is a schos, Baruch Hashem, to be able to continue today. Today's daf is Lamed Vav 36. We are picking up on the bottom of Lamed Hey Amud Beis at the two dots, the Hapas, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 lines up on the bottom. So remember again, the Mishnah yesterday introduced us to a list of items which Chazal, the rabbis, prohibited for achila, for consumption, but not for anah. Amongst them, the bread baked by a Gentile, by an akum. Says the Gemara, Aram Kan Rabbi Yochanan, Pas lo hutsha bebeis din. Pas was not bread cooked by an akum, baked by an akum, was not subsequently permitted by another beis din. So the Gemara says the fact that Rav Kahana feels the need to say this indicates to us michlal di gaman deshari, that there's clearly someone else who feels that in fact pas bread was permitted by a subsequent beis din. Who is that? In Vichi Asra Abdimi Amar. Pam achas yotzra. Again, indeed, there is someone who holds that bread of an akum was permitted. Who is that? The Gemara says, listen to this. One time, Yotza Rebbe Lasada. Rebbe went down to the field. Vehevi ovid kochab nefon of his pasporni ma'af. So Rebbe one time was in the field, and a particular akum brought before him pasporni. So pasporni is a bread made in a particular type of oven that measured a saw, a large, nice, zaftig loaf of bread. Amar Rebbe said, Kamanoe paszu, what a nice loaf of bread. Mara'u chachamim li osra. Why would the rabbis feel the need to go ahead and prohibit such a nice loaf of bread? So the Gemara says, Mara'u chacham, what do you mean, why did the rabbis prohibit it? We know this. Mishum chasnos, bread is one of those things. The reason why Chazal, interesting enough, the Mishnah did not explicitly indicate to us the reason, but the Gemara now explains the reason why the rabbis prohibited bread baked by an akum was because of chasnos. It could lead to intermarriage. The concern is that when you break bread with someone, there's certain friendship and certain closeness that's engendered. So Chazal were concerned that if a Jew were to eat the bread of a non-Jew, that could create relationships, and ultimately those relationships could chas v'shalom lead to intermarriage. To which the Gemara says, rather, the Gemara answers no. The Gemara says, I understand why there could be an issue ultimately, again, of intermarriage when it's more personal. For example, if the akum bakes up a loaf of bread in his house and I eat it, or in the city where there's proximity, but out in the field, now out in the field represents, in other words, I'm coming in contact with the akum, and this is an episodic interaction. This is not an ongoing relationship. So what Rebbe was wondering was, why would the bread of a Gentile be prohibited in the field, where the interaction again is only episodic and not going to lead to intermarriage? Now the Gemara says, so people thought when they heard this statement of Rebbe, they thought that Rebbe was in fact permitting bread baked by a Gentile, what we call pas akum. The Gemara said, Velohi, that's not true. That's not what's happening over here. Rebbe lo hitir sapas. In fact, that was not the case. Rebbe was not permitting anything. Rebbe was simply questioning and kind of going through the intellectual process. But Rebbe was not actually coming to permit bread baked by a Gentile. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Shmuel Silber, lo kach hayamaisa. So Rabbi Yosef and some say Rabbi Shmuel Silber says, no. The story, as you just recounted it, is not how it happened. The story happened in a different way. Allah Amru. Pam achas halach Rabbi lamakom echad. One time Rabbi went to a particular location, and he saw that the Jewish students, right, the Talmidei Chachamim, were having difficulty finding bread. There wasn't an ample supply of bread. Amar Rebbe, Ein kan palter? So he said, why is there no bread? Is there not a baker here? Kisurin ha'am lomar palter avik. People thought that Rebbe was even asking, isn't there at least a Gentile baker? And therefore, again, what Rebbe was essentially saying is that bread baked by a Gentile baker will ultimately be permitted. The Gemara says, "V'hu lo amar ela palto Yisrael." But in fact, Rebbe was saying, no. Rebbe was asking, isn't there a Jewish baker who is here? Rebbe Chelbo, afilu mandar palto avik kochavim. Rebbe Chelbo says like this. Even according to the opinion that says that pas akum of a baker. Now, I will say, the Gemara doesn't explicitly say this, but let's analyze this. The whole reason why the rabbis went ahead and prohibited pas akum, the bread of a Gentile, is because it could lead ultimately again to intermarriage. You break bread with someone, that creates relationships, closeness relationships could chas v'shalom result in intermarriage, which is the undoing of the very familial and national fabric of Klal Yisrael. Sefer Chazal said you can't eat the bread baked by a Gentile. Now what's interesting is, of course, this really only applies in a situation where someone is personally baking the bread. So for example, my Gentile neighbor bakes bread, I can't eat that. A palter is a baker. So you have a Gentile baker who owns a bakery. Someone comes in to purchase that bread. Bepashtos, that's not what Chazal were talking about. There's no concern of intermarriage there because there's no closeness that's engendered by the consumption of that bread. It's commercial in nature. So now the Gemara says, even according to the opinion that says that therefore you can purchase, obviously, bread that has kosher ingredients, kosher bread from a Gentile baker. That's only if there's no Jewish baker available. But where there is a Jewish baker, you cannot purchase the bread of a Gentile baker. Rabbi Yochanan says, even according to the opinion that says that you can eat bread baked by a Gentile baker, that's only out in the field. Again, and the field represents this idea of an episodic interaction. Aval be'ir, but not in the city. No, why? Mishum chasnos. Ultimately, again, because of intermarriage. So interesting. See, even for those who permitted the consumption of bread baked by a Gentile baker, or someone who did this for his parnasa, there's machlokes. Does that apply in the city or perhaps only outside of the city? The Gemara goes right there. Ivu ate the bread of a Gentile baker, of a Gentile. Rashi says over here, Menachis means no sheikh. He was eating the bread of a Gentile, Abe Mitzri, out in the fields by the borders of the field. Now, Ivo clearly felt that halacha lamaisa, because it was out in the field, therefore the gzeira did not apply. Don't talk to Ivo. Don't talk to him anymore. Why? Because he's eating the bread of a non-Jew. So you see over here, Rabbi Yitzchak felt that Ivo was acting inappropriately and therefore commanded the other people not to go ahead and engage with Ivo. So interestingly enough, this is the end of the sugya of Pas. But let's just spend just a moment on this because it's actually quite interesting. So we know. So what do we do with this? Like what is the nature of this gezerah? So clearly, what Chazal wanted us to do was to ideally eat bread that is baked by another Jew. So we call this in halacha Pas Yisrael. But what do we do contemporarily? So for example, you go ahead and you go into the supermarket. At a regular supermarket, and b'pashtus, you buy a loaf of bread, whatever the brand is, with a hashkacha on it. So proper hashkacha. So what is that? So remember again, more often than not, that's not Pas Yisrael. That's what's called Pas Palter. That is bread baked by a non-Jewish baker, in other words, a commercial enterprise, and use kosher certification to ensure that the ingredients are kosher. So the halacha l'maisa, we assume that the prohibition of Chazal, when they said you can't eat pas akum, that was bread baked by an individual idolater, an individual Gentile. Because the concern is if I break bread with my neighbor, I break bread with an individual Gentile, that engenders a relationship. That relationship could chas shalom lead to intermarriage. But essentially the halacha says Chazal will never go on commercially produced bread, right? A baker, what we call a palter, a baker, he's not baking it for me. He's baking it for whoever the customer is. And when I buy the loaf of bread, he's not like, oh, what a sweet Jew, he brought a loaf of bread. It's a customer. A customer is a customer. And therefore it does not create that sense of relationship, and therefore would not lead to intermarriage. And therefore halacha l'maisa. So that's why today you definitely have those who are makbid on Pas Yisrael, only to eat bread baked by a Jew, which means not only is it ingredient-wise kosher, but the baking process itself had Jewish intervention. What level of Jewish intervention you need in order to make it Pas Yisrael is a deeper discussion for now. But by Pashtus, when you go into the supermarket and you buy just like a major brand, a loaf of bread that has a hashkacha on it, that's not Pas Yisrael, that's what's called Pas Palter. Bread of a Gentile baker, kosher certification says that all of the ingredients are kosher, and halach l'maisa, there is no concern of intermarriage because it is commercially produced. Incredible. Next, Shemen Shalai, last line on Hebes, last line 35b. Furthermore, again, Chazal legislated that you can't ingest the oil of a Gentile. Shemen, Rav Amar Daniel Gazralov. So we'll say, so interestingly enough, there's machlokes over exactly when this gezerah against Shemen was made. So Rav says, Daniel, the prophet Daniel, went ahead and legislated this prohibition. Shmuel Amar Shmuel says, we'll say Tav Lamed Vav, 36a, Zlifasan shel kelim tmeim osarton. So at first, Shmuel saying is like this. It's because often a Gentile will go ahead and keep his oil in a kli, which sounds like tameh, which means ritually impure. Therefore, the ritually impure absorptions seep into the oil itself, and therefore render the oil unfit. Tishma says 1 second. If that's the case, then how can you buy oil from a Jew either? Maybe the Jew also kept his oil in ritually impure. In other words, we don't assume that people are makbid on the laws of ritual purity and impurity. No, rather not tameh, but rather treif. We're concerned that the Gentile stored his oil in treif utensils, non-kosher utensils, and because the oil sits there, it absorbs the non-kosher absorptions. Therefore, you can't use the oil of an akum. So fundamental machlok is Rav and Shmuel. So Rav says the gzera on shemen of oil of an akum comes from the Navi Daniel. Shmuel says it's a practical issue because the Gentile could store the oil in one of his non-kosher utensils. The oil will absorb the non-kosher absorptions. Amar Shmuel Rav. So Shmuel said to Rav, Bishlam alididi da'amina zlifasan shal kelim asurin osarton. So Shmuel says like this. Shmuel says, okay, so according to me, who says that this is an issue, the oil of an akum, shemen akum, is an issue of absorptions. That makes sense. Hainu dechi asra Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta Amar darish Rabbi Smaloi ben Etzivin. The Rabbi Smaloi darshan the following: Shemen Rabbi Yehuda based dino nimno alav etiru. So Rabbi Smaloi said that Rabbi Yehuda and his Beis Din, Rabbi Yehuda convened the Beis Din, his own Beis Din, and they permitted oil. They said as long as the oil of a Gentile is ingredient-wise kosher, there's no need to prohibit it. Kasavar, no sing tam lefgam mutter. Why? Because their logic was that even if there are absorptions that get absorbed into the oil, the absorptions are not beneficial, they're detrimental. That's what's called nosin tam lefgam. That literally, again, it infuses taste, but the taste itself is compromised and stunted. So again, this could mean a number of different things. This could either mean that they only use utensils that were not used in the last 24 hours, therefore the absorptions are dormant, or it could just mean that in general, in oil, any absorptions that come from a non-kosher utensil will only be detrimental. In any event, Rabbi Yehuda and his Beis Din felt that halacha l'maisa, there's no need to be concerned about the oil of an akum. So that makes sense. According to me, Shmuel says, but according to you, Rav, Amrat Daniel Gazer Alav, that the prophet Daniel was the one who made this enactment against the oil of an akum. So the Gemara says, how could this be Gazer Alav Daniel? Daniel Gazer v'asar Yehuda nasim avatale. Could it be that Daniel made a gzera, the Navi Daniel made a gzera, and Rabbi Yehuda and his Beis Din annulled the gzera? V'atanan, we learned, in Beis Din yachol avatal divrei Beis Din chavera, ela im kenu gadol imenu b'chacham minyan. We'll say we have a rule. Rabbinic legislation could be repealed, but in order to repeal rabbinic legislation, you need a rabbinic body of greater number and wisdom than the one who originally enacted the legislation. So Rabbi Yehuda and his Beis Din are not greater than Daniel. So how would Rabbi Yehuda and his Beis Din have the right to repeal legislation that Daniel made? Amar Alei, he responded back, Smaloi ludaka amrit. You're going ahead and you're bringing a right from Rabbi Smaloi the Ludian. So the Gemara says, Shiny Ludoi the Mizalzalu. So this is actually pretty incredible. Ultimately, don't bring a raya from the people from Ludoi. Why? Because in general, they were not careful with rabbinic law. Wow. Amar Alei, Ashlach Lei. So ultimately, again, he said to Rav, can I tell Rabbi Smaloi that you said that? Very profound. So the Gemara says, Ichsev. Rav was embarrassed and essentially, no. Which I will say is a very profound yesod in life. Never say something about someone that you would not want them to hear from your own mouth. So Rav said this disparaging statement about Rabbi Smaloi. Shmuel says, no, can I tell him you said that? To which Rav becomes embarrassed. Amar Rav, imhem lo darshu ana lo darshinon. So Rav says like this, just because Rabbi Yehuda and his Beis Din did not darshan the pasuk properly, doesn't mean that we shouldn't darshan it. What's the pasuk? Vaksiv. So we'll say this is the proof to Rav that Daniel was the one who legislated against the oil of an akum. Vaksiv. The pasuk says, "Vayasem Daniel alibo asher lo yiskoel bepas bag hamelech ubeyayin mishtaf." So again, we'll say a tremendous pasuk. The pasuk says in Daniel that Daniel promised, he took it upon himself not to go ahead and eat the bread of the king. The king is Nebuchadnezzar, and not to drink his two drinks. So the Gemara says, first wide line, Lamed Vav Amud Aleph, 36a. B'shtei Mishal Zakasa Medaris. Pasuk is talking about two different drinks. Echad mishteh yain ve'echad mishteh shemen. One is wine and one is oil. So you see from here again, this Rav says is the raya that Daniel himself was the one who legislated against the use of oil from an akum. Rav Savar alibo sam ulechol Yisrael hora. Rav says Daniel accepted this upon himself, and he also legislated this for all of Klal Yisrael. Shmuel says alibo sam ulechol Yisrael lo hora. Shmuel says no, I agree. Daniel accepted this upon himself, but Daniel did not legislate this for all of Klal Yisrael. So we'll say fundamental machlokes. Someone says, 1 second. V'shemen Daniel Gazer, is that true? That Daniel was the one who made the gzera against oil of an akum? V'amar Bali Avimi Nosa Mishmei Derav, b'yet Bali Avimi Nosa said the name of Rav, Piton Ushmanon Yenon Ubinoseyen, Kulan Mishmona Asar Davarhain. So literally again, the bread of an akum, Shemen, the oil of an akum, the wine of an akum, and the daughters of an akum, all of these are part of the 18 gzeros. So again, Rashi points out this is Gemara Masechah Shabbos, 18 gezeros that Beis Shammai was able to pass over the objections over Beis Hillel. So we see that it's Chazal, that it's later rabbis who legislated this halacha of oil, not Daniel. Maybe Daniel legislated it, but no one accepted it. And what happens? And ultimately, again, it was the students of Hillel and Shammai who then subsequently legislated the same legislation of Daniel. Daniel legislated it, but no one accepted it. Then later on, the students of Hillel and Shammai came along and legislated it, and people accepted it. If that's the case, ultimately, again, then what is Rav saying? In other words, why would Rav say that Daniel legislated the prohibition on oil if at the end of the day, after Daniel legislated it, no one listened? What's the point of that statement then? Ela Daniel gazer alav be'ir va'asu'inhu v'gazer alav afilu b'sadeh. Very interesting. Rather, Daniel legislated that the oil of an akum should be prohibited in the city, and ultimately Hillel and Shammai came along and legislated that it should be prohibited even in the field. So again, this harkens back to the previous Gemara that Daniel legislated, and apparently so oil shemen is also an issue of intermarriage. Where is there an issue of intermarriage? In the city, where people have more ongoing contact. But in the field, there's no problem. And then later on, Shammai and Hillel came along and expanded the rabbinic prohibition and said it applies even in the field. So Rabbi Huda Anasi, so 1 second. Then remember again, what did the Gemara say before? The Gemara said that Rabbi Huda and his Beis Din subsequently repealed the prohibition on oil. But how could Rabbi Huda and his Beis Din repeal legislation made by Shammai and Hillel? Really, it's the Talmidim of Shammai and Hillel. After Avoda we learned that one we just said this before, one Beis Din cannot repeal the rulings of a subsequent Beis Din, of a previous Beis Din, unless of course that subsequent Beis Din is larger in number and wisdom. So Rabbi Huda and his Beis Din are certainly not greater than the Talmidim of Shammai and Hillel. So how could he repeal it? Furthermore, Ha'amara Rabba Bar Chana and Rabbi Yochanan Bakol Yochol Levato Beis Din Divrei Beis Din Chavero Chutz Mishmor Asadavar. In general, by the way, even when it comes to the repealing of rabbinic law, you're right. So if a particular Beis Din makes a ruling, a subsequent Beis Din that is larger in size and number could repeal the previous rabbinic legislation, with the exception of the 18 enactments that were done by the students of Shammai and Hillel. Why? The Gemara says, Sha'afilu Yava Elio Beis Dino Ein Shomer Lo. Because even if Eliyahu and his Beis Din, Eliyahu Navi and his Beis Din were to come, Allah we should be zocheh. If Eliyahu and his Beis Din were to come, they can't repeal the 18 enactments. Why not? The Gemara says, Matam Hoel Upashat Isura B'Rav Yisrael. Because again, those 18 enactments, which we'll discuss some of them, were so profoundly accepted and so ingrained within the halachic practice of Klal Yisrael. Therefore, no one has the ability to repeal them. Shemen Lo Pashat Isura B'Chol Yisrael. But ultimately, again, oil. Apparently, again, this is interesting. Apparently, the prohibition on oil just never took, which is just really interesting. It just never took. So whether it was that it was legislated first by Daniel, people didn't accept it, and then subsequently legislated by Shammai and Hillel, and then it sounds like even then it wasn't really accepted. So because it wasn't really accepted, therefore Rabbi Huda and his Beis Din had the ability to formally repeal it. Then Rabbi Shmuel Abba Rabbi Yochanan, this is incredible. Yoshvu Rabbeinu ubaktu al shemen shelo pashat isro b'Rav Yisrael. The rabbis checked, and they did like an investigation, they saw that the majority of Klal Yisrael was not observing this prohibition on oil of an akum. And therefore the rabbis based themselves on the words of Rabbi Shmuel Silber, who said, Omrim, Ein gozrin Zara tzibor, ela imkein rov tzibor yecholin lamod. Barba said, this is incredible. The rabbis only have the ability to legislate rabbinic law if it is clear that the majority of the population has the ability to abide by it. But if the majority of the population is going to live in non-compliance, Chazal do not have the right to legislate, which is fascinating. So therefore the Gemara says, it turns out that although the rabbis had good intentions with prohibiting oil of an akum, it never took. Now, the Gemara doesn't tell us why it never took, right? At the end of the day, maybe it was just too difficult to get oil from Jews or whatever the situation was, but it never took root, it never took hold. Because it never took hold, therefore, by definition, just the Gzera never vested. And therefore, again, it was able to be repealed formally, subsequently, by Rabbi Yehuda and his Beis Din. Which I will say, by the way, is such a beautiful yesod. The ways of the Torah are pleasant. In general, again, if something in Yiddishkeit becomes too difficult or something in Yiddishkeit becomes too overwhelming, chances are I'm doing it wrong. Because the ways of the Torah are pleasant, the ways of Cheshbon Baruch Hu are pleasant. And therefore, again, even in rabbinic law, the rabbis have a right to legislate. But if the system sees that people just can't do it or aren't doing it, then by definition, the law falls away. The Omer of Adabar Avamaikra, what's the pasuk? And I will say, now this is a major yisod, right? This is a major concept, Kumar is saying over here, that if the rabbis legislate law and the majority of people are not listening to it, the law essentially kind of falls off. Now, it sounds like it still needs some type of formal repeal process. That was Rabbi Yehuda and his Beis Din, but essentially the law falls off. The Gemara says, where do you know that from? Mikra, what's the pasuk that supports it? I will say, Lamed Vav Amud Beis 36b. Moreover, quotes the pasuk from Malachi. Ba'me'ira atem ne'erim, v'osi atem kovim hagoy kulo. So literally again, a me'ira is a curse. Rashi says, atem mekablin aleichem gzera ba'ar beklala. You Klal Yisrael, you accepted upon yourself the responsibilities of the Torah. Literally again, with the penalty of a curse. V'ne'esar aleichem, v'achar kach osi atem kovim gozim shatem nanim shumin arurim. So the Navi seems to say that Klal Yisrael, you accepted upon yourself prohibitions, but yet then you yourself transgress those very prohibitions. The Gemara says, listen to this. Now it's interesting, the way the pasuk phrases it is Hagoy Kulo. And who's doing this? The nation as a whole. So the Navi is rebuking Klal Yisrael for accepting upon themselves certain things and then violating the very things they accepted upon themselves. But it refers to them as you accepted it as Goy Kulo, the entire nation. I'ika Goy Kulo in Ilolo. Fascinating. The Gemara says, if Goy Kulo, if the entire nation of Klal Yisrael accepted their prohibition, then Einachinami, it's binding. But if the majority of Klal Yisrael never accepted it, then obviously it is not binding. And obviously it only applies to rabbinic law. Right? Biblical law is Cheshbon Baruch Hu's word, that's not a shayla. But when it comes to rabbinic law, it's very interesting. If we see that there is a halacha, where some significance, the majority of the segment of Klal Yisrael did not accept it, just never kind of seeped into everyday practice, then ultimately it is not binding. So what's interesting about say is it appears that Shemen fell into that category. That although again the rabbis legislating said you cannot get oil from an akum for the reasons that we said before, the general population just never observed this halacha, and therefore again it never vested ultimately again as part of the body of rabbinic law. Incredible. Rabbi say Lamed Vavam Beis 36b, 3 lines down. Gufa. Amr Ba'ali Amr Vim. So according to the rest that we saw before, no Sam Yishmei Derav. Pitan Ushmanan Yeno Benoseyan, Kulam Mishwana Asar Dorain. So as we said this before, right? So remember again, the bread of an akum, the oil of an akum, the wine of an akum, the daughters of an akum, all of these are part of the 18 enactments that were made by the students of Shammai and Hillel. Says the Gemara, 1 second. Benoseyan Maihi, when you say the legislation against the daughters of an akum, the right non-Jewish women, what is that? Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Gazru Abenoseyan Nidos Me'arisoson. Chazal legislated that an akum, a non-Jewish woman, non-Jewish girl, has the status of a nida already from the cradle. Nevertheless, obviously, a woman doesn't become a nida until she actually experiences menstruation. The rabbis legislated that a non-Jewish woman has the status of a nida from the time that she's in the cradle. Why did they do this? By definition, this creates a distance between Jews and non-Jews. Since the non-Jewish woman will ultimately, again, transmit tumah from the time that she's a baby, by definition, it creates barriers. The goal of those barriers, ultimately to prevent intermarriage. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Ugniva mishmei de Rav Amar, kulan mishum avodas kochavim gazru bahen. All of these things, all of these legislation, ultimately were to prevent us, ultimately again, from engaging in idolatry. Techi asa Rav Acha bar Adam Rabbi Yitzchak, gazru apitan mishum shmanan. The rabbis legislated that you can't eat the bread of an akum, lest you come to consume their oil. The Gemara says, I don't understand. My ome shemen de shemen nipas. What does that mean? Why ultimately again? It sounds like we're more worried about their oil than their bread. Why is oil more worrisome than bread? Ella al pitan ushmanan mishum yenon. Rather, no. The rabbis legislated you can't eat the bread or the oil of a Gentile, lest you come to consume his wine. Va'al yenon mishum benosehen. And wine, we're concerned ultimately again because of their daughters. In other words, lead to intermarriage. And we're worried about if you marry their daughters, something else will happen. And then something else will lead to something else. So we're going to define that cryptic statement in just a little bit. So we'll say, I just want to point out how fascinating this is, right? Because up until now, we've always been focused on the idea that yayin, that the wine of an akum was an issue of avoda Zara. Now the Gemara really says like this: all of these gzeros, they're not exclusive, but essentially the thrust of these gzeros was intermarriage. So you can't eat the bread or the oil of an akum lest you come to drink his wine. And we're concerned that if you come to drink his wine, you're going to marry his daughter into marriage. Because again, wine, bread, oil, ultimately wine create a sense of closeness, and that closeness, chas v'shalom, could result in intermarriage. So the Gemara says, okay, let's analyze this. Now the Gemara seems to indicate, and then again, then you have the cryptic statement, and you can't marry the daughter of a Gentile, mishum davar acher, because of something else, and then also davar acher will lead to davar acher. Something else leads to something else. We'll get to that, but the Gemara says, one second. But I was saying, daraisi, you're not allowed to marry a Jewish woman, non-Jewish woman, midaraisa. That's not a rabbinic enactment. Midaraisa, you can't marry a non-Jewish woman. Where do we see that? T'chsiv, lo tischatin bam. The pasuk says you cannot marry them. Pretty explicit, talking about the Gentile nations. To which the Gemara says, "Da'araisa zayin umos avashara of dekochavim lo." It's interesting. Mid-da'araisa, the prohibition of intermarriage also only applies to the 7 nations which were indigenous to Canaan, but ultimately, again, not everyone else. The rabbis came along and said the prohibition of intermarriage applies to all non-Jews. Fascinating. So the Gemara says, "Rabbi Shmuel Silber Amar ki yasir bincha me'acharai." The rabbis call him asiros meichel. Here's the problem. Rashbi Rabbi Shmuel Silber says, not true. The pasuk says you're not allowed to marry a non-Jewish woman. Why? Ultimately, again, because she will cause your son to veer away from me, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That if you marry a non-Jewish woman, so Pasha, she's going to raise the child in her ways, and it's going to cause the child to go away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So you see from it that Rashbi says there's a biblical prohibition on marrying any non-Jewish woman, even if she's not one of the 7 nations. Ela d'oraisa ishos derechasnos. Rather, you're right. Midoraisa, there's a biblical prohibition to formally marry a Gentile woman. Va'asu inu gaza afilu derech znos. The rabbis went ahead and prohibited even a casual encounter. So mid'oraisa, marriage with a non-Jew is prohibited. Mid'rabanan, even znos, even active immorality, even a casual encounter, ultimately is going to be prohibited as well. Incredible. The Gemara says, one second. Znos nai beis dina shel shekaz. That's not true. Znos, immorality, was already outlawed by the beis din of shame. So that means sheva mitzvos b'nei Noach. We're going back early. Where do we know this from? Dichsiv. Remember again, this is after the whole episode of Yehuda and Tamar. Tamar is pregnant. They don't know who the father is. Yehuda had no reason to think that it was him. So Lamaisi says, she effectively committed adultery because she was waiting really for Yibam with the last son of Yehuda, and therefore she has to be burned. She has to be executed. So you see from here already earlier that they were careful about znos. To which the Gemara says, Ella, D'oraisa avikochav mabah bas Yisrael, Damashcha basrei. This is very interesting. Mid'oraisa, so the prohibition is in Obed Kochavim. So a Jewish woman can't marry a non-Jewish man. because the concern over there is that a woman's going to follow her husband, she's going to follow after him. But again, mid'oraisa, there would not be a problem technically with a Jewish man marrying a non-Jewish woman. However, Chazal came along and said, no, not only is it prohibited for a Jewish woman to marry a non-Jewish man, but it's prohibited for a Jewish man to marry a non-Jewish woman as well. So the Gemara says, one second. Yisrael haba alavedes kocham halacha l'Moshe Sinai. That's not true. It is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, a Sinaitic law, that a Jewish man is not allowed to have relations or marry a non-Jewish woman. Where do we know this? We just read about this 2 weeks ago. The Gemara says, last week, the Amar Mar haboel aramis kanoin poginbo. That if a Jewish man has relations with a non-Jewish woman, a zealot is allowed to kill the Jewish man. Pogimbo. We'll say, so again, that's the whole story of Pinchas, right? Zimri, Jewish man, ultimately again has relations with Cosby, a Midianite princess, and Pinchas killed them. So you see, mid'oraisa, a Jewish man is not allowed to go ahead and have relations with a non-Jewish woman. Elo, so the Raisa b'farhesya u'kemaisa shahaya. Mid'oraisa is very interesting. Mid'oraisa, the prohibition ultimately again is b'farhesya. If a Jewish man has relations with a non-Jewish woman in a public fashion, now public fashion doesn't literally have to mean that they engage in relations in front of everyone, but it means that the matter is very well known. That is the Isser D'Oraisa. And exactly like the story of Zimri and Cosby occurred in Parshas Pinchas, right? Where again, well, before Parshas Pinchas, but where again, that was an act of immorality that was known and literally seen by all. However, the rabbis came along and said, even privately, a Jewish man is not permitted to have relations with a non-Jewish woman. The Gemara says, one second. It's not true. It's not true. That is earlier legislation already. So again, a Jewish man having relations with a non-Jewish woman, even privately, was already outlawed by the Beis Din of the Chashmonaim. Hanukkah story, incredible. The Beis Din of Chashmonaim, they decreed Yisrael habalav eskochavim chayiv mishum nashga. If a Jew has relations with a non-Jewish woman, he is chay because of nashga. Now, what's nashga? Nashga is an acronym for nida, shivcha. Shivcha. Rashi points out over here Goya, and ultimately again Eshes Ish if she's married. So again, if a Jewish man has relations with a non-Jewish woman, he violates all these prohibitions. Take a quick look at Rashi. Rashi says there in Nashga, Gazra Alei Mishum Nida Dirabanan. So if a Jewish man has relations with a non-Jewish woman, it's as if he had relations with a Nida, right? V'afagav Doeles Kochavim Ein Dama Metamin Torah Sherikivim Cham Gazra Alei Mishum Shivcha. Right? So in other words, it's as if he had relations with a Nida. It's as if he had relations with a Shivcha. And ultimately, again, Mishum Avedas Kochavim to go Mischati B'derech Ishus or Mishum Eseshis. So if a Jewish man has relations with a non-Jewish woman, he violates 4 prohibitions: Nida, Shivcha, relations with a maidservant, Goya with an Akum, and Eshes Ish, and a married woman if she's married. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says, Ki Asr, we'll say first wide line, Ki Asr Rabin Amar Mishum Nashgaz. Rabin disagreed a little bit, and he said not Nashga, but rather Nashgaz. First three are the same: Nida, Shivcha, Goya, but instead of Ishes Ish yields Zona, prohibition of having relations with a harlot. Either way, what do we see from here? That there's a prohibition of a Jewish man to have relations with a non-Jewish woman, even if it's in private. And that's a pre-existing prohibition already, back to the times, ultimately, again, of the Beis Din of Chashmonaim. Ki gazru Beis Din dino shel Chashmonaim bia, aval yichud lo, va'aseinhu gazra filo yichud. You're right. The Beis Din of the Chashmonaim, they said relations with a non-Jewish woman is prohibited because of these 4 things, or you violate these 4 things. But yichud, seclusion, was permitted. And then the Talmidim of Beishan and Beisila, when they legislated, they said even yichud, even right seclusion with a non-Jewish woman is going to be prohibited. Someone says, 1 second, yichud nami Beis Dino shel David Gazra. That's not true. David HaMelech and his Beis Din were the ones who legislated the prohibition on yichud, on seclusion with any woman who is prohibited to you. Da Amar Rabbi Yehuda ba'osa shah gazru ala yichud. In that moment, what's that moment? Rashi HaKadosh points out over. He says ba'osa shah Maisa Amnon V'Tamar. Amnon and Tamar were the two children of David HaMelech. Now they shared a father, Amnon and Tamar, but they had two different mothers. It's a much longer story, but essentially Amnon violated his sister Tamar. He lusted for her, he violated her. He pretended he was ill, he asked Tamar to help come in and take care of him, and he took advantage of her. So after that occurred, David and his Beis Din legislated that you can't be alone with any woman who you're not allowed to marry. That's what's called the Isra Yichud. Any woman who's an erva to you, you're not allowed to be alone with her. So the point over here is you see that Yichud was already legislated much earlier than Shammai and Hill. It was already legislated by David HaMelech. Amri Hasam Yichud Bas Yisrael. David HaMelech and his Beis Din legislated regarding Yichud with another Jewish woman. Aval Yichud da Avodas Kochavim lo. But ultimately, again, Yichud with a non-Jewish woman, they did not legislate. Va'asu inhu. And then Shammai and Hillel came along. Gazru afilu ayichud da'ovedes kochavim. So Shammai and Hillel came along, and ultimately, again, they were gozer on yichud even with a non-Jewish woman. Incredible. So we'll say, whereas ending off over here is that what the Talmidei of Shammai and Hillel specifically legislated was even yichud with a non-Jewish woman is going to be prohibited. So Mar says, 1 second. Yichud bas Yisrael d'oraisi. First of all, 1 second. It wasn't David and his Beis Din who legislated against Yichud. Yichud is an Isra D'Oraisa. How do we know this? From where do we find the scriptural allusion to the prohibition of seclusion with any woman who is an erva to you? Shneimar ki yesischa achicha benimecha. Interesting. The pasuk is over here is talking about Avoda Zara. Literally translated, if your brother, the son of your mother, will entice you to do Avoda Zara. So Gemara says, I don't understand. The chi ben a mesis ben av eno mesis. It's only your maternal brother who could go ahead and entice you to do Avoda Zara, but your paternal brother can't. Ella ben misyached in imo ve'in achar misyached in kol harayo shebatorah. So it's very interesting. Who's going to be the brother ultimately again who is going to entice you to do Avoda Zara? One who's able to be with you at all times. Who's the brother who's able to be with you at all times? Your brother from your mother. Because your brother from your father, right, your paternal brother, can't be alone with your mother, because that's an erva to him. So therefore the Torah says, if the brother, the son of your mother, who's allowed to be alone with you and your mother, therefore he'll be with you all the time, if he entices you to do Avoda Zara, don't listen to him. Someone says, what do you see from here? Ben misyachid in imo, a son is allowed to be alone with his mother. But every other person, there's a biblical prohibition of yichud for being alone with a woman who is an erva, is prohibited to you. So we'll say, what do you see from here? That the Isra Yichud is da'oraisa. So David HaMelech and his Beis Din didn't create it. It's a da'oraisa. The Christian Gemara says, no. Yichud, I'm sorry. Yichud da'oraisa de'eshes ish. Very interesting. Mid da'oraisa, the only Isra Yichud that occurs is with a married woman. The Gemara says, Va'asa David Gazra Filu Yichud Depnuya. David HaMelech came along ultimately again. David HaMelech came along and he created a gzera even on a single woman. Right, so interesting enough. So just follow the construct over here. So Mida Araisa, the Isra Yichud, a man cannot be secluded with a woman who's married to someone else, an Eishes Ish, a married woman. David HaMelech comes along and he says, you can't have Yichud even with a woman who is a Pnuya, who is single. And the Gemara says, and what happened? Va'asu tamidei be'shan be'silal gozru afilu ayichud da'ovedes kochavim. And ultimately, again, then the Talmidim of Shammai and Hillel came along and said, even yichud with a non-Jewish woman is going to be prohibited as well. So multi-layer prohibition. So I'll say, so the Gemara, this seems to where the Gemara kind of lands in this entire conversation. So where the Gemara lands is that there is an Isra Yichud Mid'oraisa. What's the Isra Yichud D'oraisa? A Jewish man cannot be alone with a married Jewish woman. That's the D'oraisa. David HaMelech comes along and says that halacha l'maisa, you can't even have yichud together with a single Jewish woman. And then Shammai and Hillel, as part of the 18 Gezeros, said you can't even be alone ultimately with a Gentile woman. So 3 different layers of yichud. First D'oraisa, then David HaMelech, and then the Talmidim of Shammai and Hillel. So we'll stop over here for today. The Gemara is going to pick up because the conversation then kind of spills on Talmud Zayin Amud Aleph. The conversation is supposed to say now that's the first part of the brayso, right? So just to close this out. So remember again, the Gemara here structured this as saying the rabbis prohibited oil and bread, lest you come to wine of an akum. Wine of an akum is prohibited lest you come to their daughters, right? And daughters are prohibited because of davar acher, something else, and something else is prohibited because of something else. So we've explained up everything pretty much up until daughters. The last remaining piece is we prohibited daughters because of something else because of something else. But the same mishum davar acher mishum davar acher. But we'll come to that Emirat Hashem tomorrow's daf. Emirat Hashem close out the brisa. Shkoyach everyone. Have a wonderful day.